Last night, Jimmy Kimmel Live turned into a shocking political firestorm when Karoline Leavitt, the U.S. White House press secretary, was kicked off the show after a heated face-off with Jimmy Kimmel. What began as a regular interview quickly exploded into a war of words. Viewers were left speechless. The studio went into chaos. Social media blew up within minutes. People weren't sure if they were watching comedy or witnessing a political meltdown live on TV. Before we jump into this wild ride, drop a comment with where you're watching from and make sure to hit that subscribe button for more jaw-dropping stories just like this one. Karoline Leavitt walked onto the stage with confidence. Dressed in a sharp blue suit, she smiled and waved at the audience. Many cheered, some booed. She had come prepared to talk about the White House's recent policies, economic plans, and more. But things didn't go according to plan. Jimmy Kimmel started off friendly. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history." Karoline took a seat and smiled politely. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy. Happy to be here." At first, the conversation seemed normal. They talked about the economy, gas prices, and student loans. Karoline gave her answers in a calm and direct tone. She was careful with her words, just like any press secretary would be. But Jimmy wasn't going to let the interview stay polite for long. "So, Karoline," Kimmel said, leaning forward with a smirk, "do you actually believe the stuff you say at those press briefings, or is it just acting?" The audience laughed. Karoline smiled tightly. "I speak for the president and the American people," she replied. "My job is to share the facts, even if the media chooses to ignore them." Kimmel raised an eyebrow. "Facts? That's a bold word in Washington." There was laughter again, but it wasn't as loud this time. The tension in the room was starting to rise. Some of the audience members were unsure how to react. Karoline didn't back down. "You know, Jimmy, it's easy to make jokes about politics when you don't have to make actual decisions," she said. "It's harder to lead. Maybe that's why you're behind a desk and I'm standing at a podium in the White House." Ouch. The crowd gasped, some clapped, others booed. The energy in the room was shifting fast. Jimmy chuckled, but his smile looked tighter now. "Okay, fair enough. But let's be real. Your administration hasn't exactly been a model of success. The economy is shaky. The board is a mess. And don't even get me started on your boss's approval ratings." Karoline nodded slowly. "Criticism is part of the job. But what are you offering, Jimmy? Jokes, memes, late-night laughs. The American people deserve better than cheap shots from Hollywood." The air was thick. Producers backstage were whispering into their headsets. They had expected a spicy conversation, but not an all-out war. Jimmy decided to turn up the heat. He played a clip on the big screen behind them. It was from one of Karoline's press briefings where she stumbled over reporters' question about the inflation rate. The clip zoomed in on her awkward pause and the smirk of a reporter in the front row. The audience burst into laughter. Karoline kept her face still, but her eyes flashed. "That's the best you've got," she said. A 5-second clip taken out of context. "You know, Jimmy, maybe you should apply for a job at CNN." The crowd was divided. Some roared with laughter, others cheered for her, but the mood was no longer light. Jimmy leaned forward. His smile was gone. "Now you talk a lot about context, Karoline," he said. "But what's the context for misleading people? What's the context for defending chaos?" Karoline leaned in too. "The real context is this. Your show survives on division. You need people to hate each other so they keep watching. I came here to talk policy. You came to score points." That was it. The energy snapped. Phones were up. People were recording. The studio was no longer just a set. It was a battlefield. Behind the scenes, a producer was heard saying, "This is going off the rails. Do we cut to commercial?" "No," the director replied. "Let it roll. This is gold." Karoline turned to the crowd. "You don't have to agree with me," she said. "But don't let Hollywood comedians decide what's true. They are here to entertain you, not inform you." Jimmy raised a hand. "Let me stop you right there. If anyone's deciding what's true, it's the press secretary who dodges every real question." Karoline shot back. "Maybe if reporters asked real questions, I wouldn't have to dodge anything." The crowd gasped again. One person shouted, "Let her talk." Another yelled, "Send her back to DC." Producers were now panicking. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was war, and it was only getting started. The atmosphere in the studio was electric. The crowd was divided. Half of them were clapping for Jimmy. Half was silently nodding at Karoline. Phones were still recording. Every second was being streamed, clipped, and posted online in real time. But no one, not the producers, not the audience, not even Jimmy himself, expected what happened next. Karoline Leavitt stood her ground. Her face was calm, but her voice had sharpened. "Let's talk about facts, Jimmy," she said. "You talk about misinformation, but how many times have you twisted things on this show for laughs?" Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "I'm a comedian. I make jokes. That's what people come here for." Karoline leaned forward. "And I'm a press secretary. I share a policy. I don't have a laugh track to cover up my points." The audience murmured again. Even the cameraman looked confused. Was this still a late-night talk show or a live debate? Jimmy dropped the jokes. "Karoline, do you really think you're helping people?" he asked. "Because from the outside it looks like you're just spinning for a president who can't speak clearly, can't lead, and can barely stay awake." Karoline's jaw tightened. "Say what you want about the president, but at least is not hiding behind a desk, taking pot shots. From a safe distance. Leading isn't easy, Jimmy. It means facing criticism every day. Sometimes unfair, often dishonest. But we show up. We take it. We fight back. That's more than I can say for some of your friends in the media." The room went quiet again. Jimmy was speechless for a second. "I invited you here to have a real conversation," he said. "But clearly you came to argue." Karoline looked straight at him. "No, Jimmy. I came here to defend the truth. But if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should stick to making jokes about celebrities and stay out of politics." Boom. That did it. The audience exploded. Some stood up and cheered. Others booed loudly. The split in the room was now undeniable. One half saw Karoline as a hero standing up to the media. The other half saw her as the face of a broken system. Backstage, the control room was in chaos. "We need to cut to break. This is spiraling. No. No. Let it run. This is history happening right now." The director looked pale. Ratings were going through the roof, but the risk of total disaster was seconds away. Jimmy shook his head and leaned toward the camera. "All right, folks. That's all the time we have with the White House's favorite spin doctor." But Karoline stood up. "No, you know what? I'll save you the trouble." She pulled off her mic and turned to the audience. "I came here hoping to have a real discussion, but clearly Jimmy isn't interested in anything beyond cheap applause and one-liners. I won't be part of this circus." And just like that, Karoline Leavitt walked off stage. The crowd gasped. Some people stood up. Others reached for their phones. Camera crews scrambled to follow her, but Karoline didn't look back. Jimmy tried to brush it off with a joke. Well, that was different. But his voice lacked its usual confidence. The damage had been done. The segment cut to an emergency commercial break. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Hashtags like #Karoline versus Kimmel, #Press Secretary Walkout, and #Late Night Meltdown were trending across Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Clips of the moment were being shared by news pages, meme accounts, and influencers. Some praised Karoline for her courage. Others mocked her for storming off. One viral tweet read, "Karoline Leavitt just made late-night history. Whether you love her or hate her, that woman didn't flinch." Another said, "This is what happens when you invite propaganda into your living room." Even celebrities were chiming in. Some stood with Karoline. Others sided with Jimmy. The divide wasn't just political anymore. It was cultural. Back in Washington, reporters were already asking questions. At the next morning's briefing, Karoline was back at her podium looking fresh and unfazed. A reporter asked, "Karoline, do you regret walking out on Jimmy Kimmel Live last night?" She smiled. "No regrets. I came there with respect. I left with my dignity." The room fell silent for a second. Then the next question was thrown her way. She answered calmly, clearly, and confidently, like nothing had happened, but everyone knew something had changed. Jimmy's apology. That night, Jimmy Kimmel returned to his show. He tried to laugh it off. "Well, folks, I don't know if I should thank Karoline for coming or apologize to my producers for the blood pressure spike." The crowd laughed weakly. Jimmy sighed. "Okay, in all honesty, I probably pushed her buttons. Maybe I went too far." The audience clapped. It wasn't a full apology, but it was close. Still, the damage was done. This wasn't just a TV moment anymore. It had become a political flashpoint. Conservative networks ran the story non-stop, calling Karoline brave and unshakable. Liberal commentators called her defensive and overly aggressive. Every political podcast, YouTube channel, and news anchor had an opinion. Some said it was staged. Others said it was spontaneous. But one thing was clear. America was watching. The walkout had become bigger than anyone expected. What started as a tense TV exchange had grown into a national storm. And at the center of it all, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history. The next morning, newsrooms across the country lit up like fireworks. Everyone had a take. CNN called it a meltdown of diplomacy. Fox News called it a bold stand against media bullying. Talk radio exploded. On one side, Karoline was praised for defending the administration and standing firm. On the other, she was accused of dodging real questions and running from scrutiny. But there was one thing nobody could deny. She had made headlines. The administration stands behind her. That afternoon, the president walked out of the Oval Office for a scheduled press event. But before he spoke about infrastructure, a reporter shouted, "Mr. President, do you support Karoline Leavitt's actions on Jimmy Kimmel Live?" He smiled and said, "Karoline's got more backbone than half the people in Congress. She did just fine." The press room went silent. A moment later, reporters rushed to send out the quote, "Support from the top." That changed everything. Later that evening, Karoline appeared on a live stream. Her own social media, no filters, no edits. Wearing a simple blue shirt, sitting in her home office, she spoke calmly. "I didn't go on Jimmy Kimmel Live to fight. I went there to speak. But if the only way I'm allowed to speak is by being mocked or shut down, then maybe it's not really a conversation anymore. It's a trap." She didn't sound angry. She sounded honest. The live stream hit 4 million views in under 12 hours. Back on the late-night stage, Jimmy Kimmel wasn't having his best week. Ratings had jumped the night of the incident, but the next night they dropped. And the next and the next. Critics began to ask if he had gone too far. Even a few fellow comedians said on podcasts that it might have been better to let her talk instead of turning it into a standoff. One journalist wrote, "Jimmy Kimmel forgot the golden rule of late night. If you're going to throw punches, make sure they are funny." Last night, he wasn't a comedian. He was a political hitman with a monologue. On TikTok and YouTube, thousands of creators began posting videos titled "My Thoughts on Karoline Leavitt versus Jimmy Kimmel." Some stitched clips from the show with commentary. Others made memes. But surprisingly, many young viewers, especially Gen Z and younger millennials, started defending Karoline. She stood her ground. She didn't yell, didn't get emotional. She just walked away. Respect. A surprising shift was underway. Karoline, the government spokesperson, was gaining fans in places where government officials usually weren't welcome. Then came the celebrity responses. Some actors and musicians mocked Karoline. One A-list comedian posted, "If you can't take a joke, don't sit at the table." But others came out in support. An unexpected tweet from actor Chris Pratt read, "I may not agree with everything she says, but I respect the way she carried herself." That took guts. Soon, conservative actors and musicians started backing her publicly. Even non-political influencers started weighing in. The lines were blurring. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about tone, class, and how people treat each other in public. Behind the scenes, the Kimmel crisis. Back at ABC, Jimmy's producers were in panic mode. Advertisers were pulling back. Sponsors didn't want to be involved in a toxic media event. Jimmy was called into a board meeting. One exec reportedly said, "You can push the envelope, but don't tear it apart." Jimmy responded, "I didn't expect her to walk out." She didn't walk out. The exec said she walked through you and the audience saw it. Karoline's next move. By the end of the week, Karoline was invited to several major interviews from both right-leaning and left-leaning platforms, but she declined most of them. Instead, she released a series of short videos answering the exact questions Jimmy had tried to ask. This time without interruptions, jokes, or bias. Each video was under 5 minutes, clear, direct, and filled with facts. Viewers appreciated the format. Millions tuned in. One video titled, "What I Wanted to Say on Jimmy Kimmel" broke 10 million views in 3 days. Polls began to emerge. 51% of respondents said Karoline handled the situation better than Jimmy. 62% said they now viewed late-night TV as overly biased. 39% said they gained respect for Karoline after the incident, even if they disagreed with her politics. Karoline wasn't just a press secretary anymore. She had become something bigger, a symbol of standing your ground in a world full of noise. In high schools and college campuses, students began requesting Karoline as a guest speaker. A conservative student group made shirts that read, "I stand with Karoline." Meanwhile, late-night shows scrambled to avoid similar disasters. Some even postponed interviews with political figures to avoid controversy. But the spark had already been lit. What happened between Karoline and Jimmy wasn't just a moment. It was a message, one that was spreading fast. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just trending anymore. She was shaping the conversation. What began as a late-night walkout had become a nationwide debate about respect, truth, and the role of the media. And now, both sides were preparing for the final round. Karoline's tour begins. By now, Karoline had refused multiple mainstream interview requests. Instead, she launched her own media tour on her terms. She began visiting colleges, town halls, and even military bases where she gave short speeches titled, "Say It Straight." The message was always the same. You don't have to agree with me, but you do have to let me speak. Clips from her speeches went viral. One especially powerful moment came at a women's leadership forum in Texas where she said, "Silencing someone with jokes isn't clever, it's lazy. If your argument is stronger, prove it. Don't shout, debate." The crowd gave her a standing ovation. Kimmel faces the mirror. Back at the studio, Jimmy Kimmel couldn't escape the backlash. Each new episode brought fewer viewers. Each monologue was picked apart online. Even fans of the show started noticing that his jokes didn't land the same anymore. The magic felt off. Producers suggested a formal apology to Karoline, but Jimmy wasn't ready. He thought things would blow over, but they didn't. Then, on one particularly quiet night, Jimmy opened his show with a pause, looked straight at the camera, and said, "I've always tried to be funny, honest, and bold. But maybe last week, I was just rude. Karoline Leavitt, if you're watching, sorry for not letting you speak your piece." The apology spread fast. Some said it was too late. Others called it brave. But for Jimmy, it was the first step in healing his image. The White House responds. When asked about the apology, Karoline's response was short and graceful. "I appreciate it," she said. "That's what adults do." Behind the scenes, the White House staff praised Karoline for how she had handled everything with class, strength, and clarity. Even the president privately told aides, "She just won over half the country with one walkout." That's not media training. That's instinct. Hollywood's divide. The entertainment world didn't know how to handle what had happened. Some comedians doubled down and mocked the apology. Others remained quiet, realizing the tide of public opinion had changed. A few even began reconsidering how they approached political guests on their shows. Netflix quietly shelved 2 planned specials that were going to mock political figures, afraid the moment wasn't right. It was clear Karoline had changed the rules of the game. A surprising ally. Weeks later, Karoline received a handwritten note in the mail. It was from Oprah Winfrey. The letter read, "You reminded the world that strength doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means walking away with your head high. Well done." That letter was never posted online. Karoline kept it private. But the fact that Oprah reached out, that said a lot. New polls, new reality. A month after the event, Gallup released a public trust report. Trust in mainstream media was at its lowest point in 10 years. 57% of respondents said they wanted more balance and less sarcasm in political interviews. 46% said they'd be more likely to listen to government officials if media hosts stopped trying to score points. Karoline's approach had struck a chord. By the end of the year, Karoline had gained over 10 million followers across social media. Her YouTube series, Say It Straight, had become a staple in high school civics classes across multiple states. She received an invitation to speak at the United Nations Youth Forum. Even more surprisingly, she was asked to give the commencement speech at a top liberal arts college in California, a place that normally wouldn't host someone from her political side. But students had voted and they chose her. In December, ABC announced that Jimmy Kimmel Live would be going on a creative hiatus. The network said it had nothing to do with recent events, but everyone knew the truth. The Karoline moment had changed everything. During a year-end speech, Karoline addressed everything one last time. She stood in front of a large crowd at the Lincoln Center in New York and said, "This wasn't about right or left. This was about right and wrong. You don't have to like me, but you can't bully me into silence because I work for the American people, not for applause and not for a laugh track." The audience erupted. No matter what came next, future office, media roles, or a return to private life, Karoline had earned something most people in politics never find. Respect from both sides. She had taken a moment of humiliation and turned it into power. She had been underestimated, mocked, and interrupted. But she didn't fight back with insults. She fought back with class. And in doing so, she reminded America of something it had almost forgotten. That truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply walks out the door and lets the world follow.